Right. Good afternoon to everyone. And thank you so much for joining us when we know you are super busy. I'm going to just quickly share this and I'm sorry, I'm using one computer screen today. It's like that's the end of the world for someone who has two. So I'm going to just quickly put this screen up. Right. So today's webinar, which we're so excited to present to you, is Constructed Wetlands, Collecting and Cleaning Grey Water in an Urban Slum. And we're so excited to have Professor Andrew Thatcher with us. So just to quickly remind you, if you don't mind, please mute your mics and keep your camera off during the presentation. It does help when it's load shedding. It also helps just to stream a little bit better and that we don't have dogs barking in the background. But we do want you to please ask questions and to sit back and enjoy this. Okay, so put the questions in the comment box if you want, in the chat. We can answer it afterwards, and afterwards there'll also be a short little time for that. So, Bridget, would you please introduce Professor Thatcher to us?
It would be an honor, and your CV is beyond impressive. Thank you. Thank you for making the time. And of course, this is Geo Awareness Week, and I am wearing my there we go, my AAG, American Association t-shirt. And just a little punt, please sign up for SAGTA membership, because as a SAGTA member, you also have access. You are also a full paid up member for the AAG, and they have a wonderful journal, as we do, and a wealth of wonderful information available to you. So thank you, because it was so nice to be able to let the AAG know that South Africa was actually having an event for Geo Awareness Week. They always had these weeks at the end of our year. We also have GIS week in the middle of exams. So not ideal. I'm suggesting that maybe SADC has their own Geography Awareness Week at a more opportune time for us. But without further ado, I just want to mention a few things here. There are a few things that you didn't put in the bio. So with your permission, because I've known you for a long time, I'm going to be bringing a few things up. But just to say that when I saw that you got the Vice Chancellor's Research and Innovation Award this year, and I don't know if it was linked to this project, congratulations. I mean, that is a huge kudos, not only to Wits University, my old university as well, but also to you, and congratulations, Prof. And your CV, and this is the abridged CV. I just want to just read out the one, because I think this is a wonderful term for us geographers. So with your research focus within the field of human factors and ergonomics, which is abbreviated as HFE. Prof Thatcher is recognized as an international leader in its work on sustainability. His research has looked into the psychological factors in the adoption of sustainable technologies, the impact of sustainable technologies on well-being, health, and effectiveness, notably green buildings, development and application of human factors and ergonomics, HFE, systems analysis, tools to global problems, and the development of theoretical models of sustainability for this field. Your most recent focus has been on integrating ecological models of complex adaptive systems into HFE systems. And you're now looking into issues such as system hierarchies, resilience, and adaptability might also be used to intervene for sustainable work systems. And there's some wonderful geographic terminology in all of that. But what I'm so impressed with, and I have to mention, is how many publications, 81 peer-reviewed publications in internationally recognized journals, 75 conference papers and presentations, and may I say 76, because you are now presenting at the esteemed SAGTA webinar. Thank you so much. And also, I've gone and neglected to say, because I think I've left out, oh, here we go. Authored 7 books, 17 book chapters, and 19 keynote addresses. You are also inspired and taught by my cousin, John, a geographer, and your son took geography to matric. And not only do you keep fit by running park runs, but also you are an all-round awesome individual that I'm very proud to be associated with and to call my friend. Thank you for making yourself available to coming in to share your insights with us.
Thank you, Bridget. You embarrassed me, but in a nice way. So thank you very much for that very kind introduction. And also to Enika, that lovely picture of Typha capensis in the constructed wetlands. I just need to make sure I can get rid of this. What I'm going to be doing now is just popping up my presentation. And then we can get started. Yeah, just to answer Bridget's question from earlier, that Vice Chancellor's Teaching Award was for innovation and social impact, which I'm most proud about is that social impact side of things, and it was exactly for this particular project. So I've actually given the very early part of this presentation. Those who joined a little bit earlier would have heard me talk about the first time I gave this presentation to a SAGTA conference which was in Pretoria at St. Mary's DSG in 2019 in the land before COVID, and there we were just starting the project. And so those of you who were there, this will be an update on that to show you what actually ended up happening through the project, which also took place over COVID, I might add, which added a few complications. So very quickly, the URBWAT project was about, it says constructed wetlands, but the actual project basis was to install a nature-based solution for the problem of grey water disposal, collection, and then treatment so that it would have a lower impact on the environment. Just a bit of background on where this sort of happened. So it happened in a context where we have an enormous amount of inequality. In this particular picture, it shows us Alex Township in the foreground, one of the oldest townships in Johannesburg, and in the background, the richest square kilometer on the African continent. And these two places exist within kilometers of one another. And so we have to try to see what ends up happening in these two different environments and how we can ensure equality between them. Where did we actually work? This is a bit of a recap. We worked in an area which is known as Siswetla. Siswetla itself is just up over here. Hopefully you can see my cursor. It sits between the cemetery and the Yixkay River. On the north part of Alexandra, not really directly part of Alexandra, more sort of sitting between Marlborough Gardens and the east bank of Alexandra itself. In that sort of area, sitting up over there where the red arrow is, where the red circle is. A little bit zooming in, we didn't look at the whole of Siswetla in this particular project. We just looked at a small part of Siswetla, which sits fairly close to both some wealthier areas in Kelvin, right next to a world-class railway system in the Gautrain, and stuck between bits of apartheid infrastructure, where we managed to put an Indian settlement between the white settlement and the black settlement. And so we're sitting in this rather archaic form of apartheid town planning. In itself, we were looking at a small little area inside Siswetla. This was a picture which was taken in 2019 when the project was first starting, which was stuck right on the banks of the Yixkay River, a little place called Silvertown, in between what was called the greenhouse, which was set up by Gift of the Givers, and on the other side of the Yixkay River, an old abandoned wastewater treatment plant, which was rather ironic given what it is we were trying to do. This context over the course of this project has changed significantly. So you saw a zoom-in picture in 2019 of that area of Silvertown. If you look at it a year later, it looks almost unrecognizable. Silvertown is hidden in between all of these rest of these buildings, and this large amount of settlement, which has happened just within the space of 1 year to the north of Silvertown. And then in 2020, 2023, you'll see that a whole lot of other changes have also happened. There's a soccer field which they managed to put in for recreation purposes, and has become even more dense around the Silvertown area. What we did when we started off with this project, and I've actually updated the figures from where they were in 2019 when I last gave this presentation. What we were doing in 2019 is that we only went up to 500,000, and what we knew before the water came into the Siswetla area down the Yekske River, it was very high, and when it came out of Siswetla on the other side of Siswetla, it was even higher, but we couldn't actually tell you how much higher. So this graph over here is actually on a log scale, or exponential scale, I should say, rather, which means that when the water is coming in, the E. coli, which are measured in coliform units, basically colony-forming units, they are roughly sitting somewhere between 1 million and 10 million CFUs per millimeter. So that's the water coming into Siswetla, roughly sitting somewhere between 1 million and 10 million coliforming units per milliliter. By the time it goes past Siswetla, it's sitting somewhere between 1 billion and 1 trillion coliform units. Basically, there is so much bacteria in there that you can literally put a spoon in and stand a spoon up in the water. It's actually probably more coliform than it is water itself. That's how much pollution is accumulated in the form over here of fecal coliforms as it moves past this informal settlement. And this, of course, this Yekske River eventually ends up in the Hartbeespoort Dam. And any of you who are thinking about recreational activities in the Hartbeespoort Dam, I would strongly advise against that. And any of the number of settlements which it passes through between that, including places like the rather wealthier suburbs of Lone Hill and Waterfall Estate. So what is the problem here with grey water? The people in this particular settlement have access to piped water, municipally provided water in the form of standpipes, communal standpipes, which they can collect water from, but there's nowhere for them to throw their wastewater away. So what ends up happening is that once their wastewater that might be used for cooking or for cleaning themselves or for cleaning their homes, ends up in the environment, either running through the environment, which is what some of these pictures show, or accumulating into pools together with other types of refuse that it collects in that particular environment. It is a particular problem because it ends up in the rivers. That picture on the right-hand side, that rather dark color flowing through the rubbish is actually what we call grey water, and you can see that it's a very, very dark grey. And it also comes in contact with people. And this particular small child, which I took a photograph of, about a minute after this, he'd picked up a stick, put the stick into that water and put that stick into his mouth. I read a paper earlier this week that shows that when the first rains start coming, round about now, this time of year, we see a huge big spike in hospitalizations of small children from diarrheal diseases. And unfortunately, roughly about 15 children per month die in South Africa from diarrheal diseases. And we're not talking about cholera and dysentery, we're talking largely about issues coming from fecal E. coli. We also have a particular problem in that space is limited, and these particular photographs over here show the types of spaces that are available for us to try to put in a solution. So we're really constrained in the types of solutions that we might be able to put in. In addition to the grey water, we also have other different types of interconnected water issues, including things like burst sewer mains. This particular sewer main, which I took a picture of here, was basically from Marlborough Gardens. That had become blocked and spewed sewage through this particular settlement of Silvertown for approximately 3 months. So not a couple of days, months. And then we also have problems when the storms come along. Stormwater flows through the environment, picking up whatever rubbish is going on in that environment and depositing it into people's houses. Water collection happens usually from these standpipes in buckets, usually 20-litre buckets of converted penitents and various other different types of varieties. And water disposal is usually into the environment in either gullies that have been dug, such as the ones I'm showing here, or just purely into the environment and a natural flow down to the river. So how did we start this project? Well, shortly after I met with you guys the last time, we started our initial design workshops. What we wanted to do is work with people in the community to try to come up with identified solutions. And we wanted to have the solutions working in such a way that they would be nature-based solutions. So we had 6 different workshops with roughly 20 people in the workshop each time, people from the community, where we looked at diagnosing the particular problem, and then trying to come up with solutions. And the solution that we came up with was to look at something which we called an iterative design. So instead of looking at one particular intervention and then seeing whether that was going to work, it became quite obvious that we wouldn't be able to do that. First of all, people didn't really know what a nature-based solution would look like. And even if they did know what a nature-based solution would look like, there were too many of these different competing demands to know which one would actually work. So what we did is we designed an intervention strategy that would look at build, evaluate, look at how we might change it, build again, build a second time. What I've shown over here is actually what we ended up doing. We had a strategy in 2019 that essentially what we would do is we would rotate this through 6 months. So every 6 months we would put something in, evaluate it, and then redesign it and move forward. What ended up happening, as you might notice, between 2020 and roughly halfway through 2021 was the little problem of COVID. And so in this particular environment, particularly for 6 months, we weren't allowed to even go in to that area because of the risks that we might transmit into a highly congested urban environment, COVID, and we really didn't want to be responsible for that. So for 6 months, there wasn't really very much that we could do. We did visit and we did look and see what was going on, and we did make some small modifications, which I'll show you now. So we identified 3 building sites from the people that we went into this area called Silvertown, and the residents of Silvertown helped us identify 3 different sites where we could build. In the first phase, we actually only built something at CW1 and CW2, so constructed wetland 1 and constructed wetland 2. And site 3 we used as a comparison site. So we're saying, well, this is a site where we could have, but what ended up happening in this site that was different from the other 2 sites? We, on the basis of the drawings which people in that area had worked with us, and working with people in the area, so these are all people who live in Silvertown, who helped us build, design, and build these particular constructed wetlands. We came up with these 2 different designs. What we have over here is a raised platform for pouring the water in. We have the gravel beds where the grey water would pour through. And what we did is we planted Juncus effusius. If you know anything about wetland plants, Juncus effusius is an indigenous South African sedge grass, which we'd actually seen growing in the Yixkay River. So we thought that this would be a good opportunity to say, well, if it could survive in that water, perhaps we can plant Juncus in this particular wetland and then see what ends up happening. This is what happened 6 months later. So just to give you a bit of a timeline over here, we finished those wetlands on the Tuesday in March 2020. And on Thursday, on the Thursday of that same week, we went into a hard lockdown. So we really, for 6 months, gave it a hard test. We didn't do anything. And this is essentially what we were left with when we came there 6 months later, when we were first able to go back in with face masks and all the other types of sanitary and protective equipment that we needed to take with us. This is what we found. There were a couple of Juncus over here that had managed to survive, but pretty much they were all dead. And in fact, if you go back a photograph, you'll notice that this particular wetland over here, where this gentleman over here is sitting. And you'll notice that someone had built their home right up against the wetland. So it wasn't just that our wetland had changed, it is the entire environment around it had also changed. So we thought, we we looked at what might have ended up happening, and we tried a couple of interventions. So the first thing we did is, against this particular corrugated iron, what we did is we found someone in the community and they painted for us a diagram of what the wetland actually was and showed people how to use it. And then what we also did is we thought, well, maybe these yuccas that we'd got, which were actually bought from a nursery in Melville, where I stay, maybe they weren't the right plants, maybe they weren't habituated. And so we went down to the Yixgay River with a lot of protective equipment and dug out the yuccas on the banks of the Yixgay River, and we replanted the constructed wetlands with that. And so another 4 months after that, what we had is, you can see there's also some Xanthidea, some arum lilies. And what you found is that after, when we actually planted them with the plants that come from that area, the plants managed to survive. So there is something about saying we can't just get plants from a nursery. We need to get plants that are habituated to that environment and plant them in there. And then we also have a picture of Goodwill, who very kindly allowed me to take his picture of the drawings showing people how to use the wetland itself and also what to not use it for. What we did after that is we ran a usability study. We had some of my students come in and they did observations over 3 days, and we looked at how people were actually using these wetlands. And you'll see that two things happened. First of all, we found that there weren't actually a lot of people using these wetlands. And when they did use the wetlands, you can see in this picture in the middle, they were throwing their water to the side and not actually into the wetland. And the entry point was being used as a table rather than being used as an entry point for the wetland. There was some water going into the wetland when people had much smaller buckets, but these larger buckets, which are in this particular case over here used for washing clothes, were not actually being used. And so we went back to the drawing board again, and we went back to the people living in Silvertown, and we looked at what it is that we could be doing and also to try to get it to work. What we did notice, though, when we're looking at the hard science type of things, is that the wetlands were working. So when we looked at measuring, and this is the chemists on the project, what they were looking at is measuring the E. coli as it went in, the entry points, and E. coli at the exit points. And again, this is on an exponential scale. You'll see that the outs generally are much lower than the ins. So the inputs, so the outlets are much lower, except for one point over here in September 2020. The rest of the times, the E. coli measured as it came out was much lower. In fact, what we found is that it was reducing roughly 90% of the bacteria, and 60% of the organic matter was being removed through the wetlands themselves. And something called COD, or which is essentially a measure of the oxygen demand, the chemical oxygen demands in the water, shows us that a lot of the oxygen was being used up so there was a high oxygen demand in these particular wetlands, which shows that there was a lot of bacterial and life activity which was happening in the wetlands themselves. Here are some of the engineering sketches that we had of now looking at Wetland 3. We didn't actually design Wetland 3. Well, we designed Wetland 3, sorry, we didn't actually implement Wetland 3 at phase 2. We implemented it at phase 3. But what you'll see is that what we did based on our observations and chatting to the people in the environment is we built a washing area. And this washing area then directly connected onto the old wetland, so the wetland from phase 1, and then a much longer section that we had. And we designed this for a number of particular reasons. First of all, we noticed that people were bending over a lot when they were doing their washing. And we didn't want them to have to lift up a large, heavy type of bucket when they were doing their washing. So instead, what we did is we created a washing area so they could lift their empty buckets onto there and then fill it up with water and do their washing in that particular area. And then when they'd finished their washing and they needed to empty it, all they needed to do was turn over the buckets, and then the water would flow down the sloped washing area into that inlet into the wetland. And then it would then flow through the wetlands, and we'd see what ended up happening. So here is the particular design. So this is actually what it looks like in real life. This is the ones on the left and in the middle. are wetland 1. So on the left-hand side, you can see the sort of diagram of showing it's sort of flowing through 2 different taps, 1 tap. So for example, if someone was washing, someone else could still come along and collect water for their house, or for drinking or for cooking. And then it would flow into that wetland. That picture in the middle shows how we elevated the wall. And if you notice how we made the wall much wider. So as I said, for 3 months, the sewage flowed through this area. And it actually didn't flow into people's houses because we designed this gutter along the side. Ostensibly, we designed it to protect them from stormwater, but it actually also worked to protect the residents from the sewage which spilled in that particular area. And on the right-hand side, you can see that we also had to build walls to keep the water away from, and that's wetland 2 on the right-hand side there, but a similar type of design that was happening, and someone was also building their house almost right onto that wetland. We then allowed this to settle for 6 months again, and then we went in and we had a look, and we did another observational study looking at what ended up happening in this environment. So you can see the ladies on the left-hand side, they were using it exactly as we had intended, and this gentleman on the right-hand side, not quite exactly as we'd intended, because he's actually standing on the side where the grey water flows past. But you can see how it protected the houses from that grey water and preventing it from going into people's houses. And the walls themselves were actually used as meeting points. In fact, that one on the right-hand side was a very popular meeting point. It was sheltered from the wind, and it was a great place to go and have some casual conversations and maybe smoke a little bit of weed. So essentially what we ended up managing to design was areas which were more multifunctional. You can see in this particular photograph, you can actually see the sewerage flowing. So it comes in from the left-hand side of this picture and flows down next to our wetland. So we're keeping it separate from the wetland, but also separate from people's houses. And it also acted as a walkway. So people didn't actually have to walk through that sewage, but it could actually step up onto the constructed wetland itself. The plants have relatively survived relatively well, not fantastically well, but they are surviving. When we actually look at taking chemical measurements about what's going on, the first thing we notice is that the water coming in is highly alkaline. The pictures on the left-hand side show us why, as well as the probe that was in there to measure the pH levels. And that's because we have a lot of washing liquids, which tend to be quite alkaline. And what we find is over the course of the wetlands, that becomes neutralized back to, from sitting at a pH of roughly around about 9 or just below or just above 9, down to a more acceptable 7.5, somewhere about there. So it's still slightly alkaline as it goes through, but its alkalinity is reduced as it goes through the wetland. The total coliform units are quite varied. Again, this is on an exponential scale. We'll find that on some occasions it does reduce the amount of coliforms, but in other situations it doesn't. We did various different types of E. coli measurements. And we find that it is not necessarily removing as much E. coli as when it was at low use. But remember, it's at much higher use now. We also find that when we look at what's happening inside the wetland, this is a measure over here of redox potential, which is also another measurement of chemical oxygen demand. We find that if we look at the in points versus the out point, that there's a lot of activity going on in the wetland. So what we find is our wetland is working incredibly hard. There is just too much E. coli going in here. The types of measurements of E. coli going in here are sitting, if we go back over here at the endpoints, they're sitting at roughly 10 million E. coli units, between 10 million and 100 million E. coli units that are going into the wetland. So there's a lot of E. coli in here. And the wetland itself is working very hard to try to remove the E. coli. There is just too much E. coli in there for it to remove it. And so every now and then when we get these flush effects, for example, when someone pours a bucket of fresh water into there, what it does is it flushes through the system, and it actually flushes the E. coli out rather than having a longer residence time. So what we need in this type of environment is a much longer residence time. So in summarizing, and I'm getting to the end of my talk now because your two facilitators said that I must try to keep this at roughly half an hour so I can leave some time for questions. What we managed to do is significantly increase the amount of grey water intake through this redesign process. We also managed to have a number of other types of benefits which weren't the primary purpose of what we were doing, but also are incredibly important for the community. And those include things like having a raised walkway for the community residents, so they didn't actually have to walk in this sewage as you see it passing over here. It also acted as a stormwater, as a sewage spillage protection. We created communal areas where washing activities, particularly if we compare this to the rural environment, we have mostly women who are doing the washing, so creating these communal areas. We've reduced the chances of back injury by raising the platform for the washing so that they don't have this excessive stooping postures. We've heightened awareness around grey water and grey water risks, which means that people in the environment are more living in this environment, are more aware of what's going on. And probably equally importantly, we've created a huge amount of goodwill in this area and engagement. We continue to be involved with not just this project, but with a number of other people who've found us out and are also trying to do different projects. There are at least 7 different departments at the university who are now working in this area, and that's part of the goodwill which we've developed going into that project. But there are things which have been less of a success, and these are also important to notice. The increased grey water disposal into the constructed wetlands has led to reduced residence time and therefore a lower treatment effect. In other words, we're a victim of our own success. By making it more successful, by putting more water into it, we get less of a treatment effect. We also notice that there's a rapid amount of sludge accumulation in the constructed wetlands. Within 3 or 4 months, they become completely clogged with sludge. We've gone and we've measured the sludge. Most of the sludge actually comes from fabrics. So in other words, from the washing process, you know, that hand washing process rubs off a lot of fabrics into there, and that gets caught up in the gravel, and it starts to block the treatment function. So we need to look at a different way of creating maintenance, or alternatively settling to try to remove the sludge before it enters into the wetland. In the constructed wetland 2, there's actually a picture of constructed wetland 2. That repeated sewage spillage eventually led to sewage accumulation, and eventually it flooded the wetland. So what you see on the right-hand side there is a wetland that is no longer operating as a wetland, because as soon as the sewage spills, it overflows into that wetland. And essentially what we have is not a grey water treatment system, but a black water treatment system. And constructed wetlands are not designed for black water treatment. I neglected to tell you about constructed wetland 3. We built a large portion of constructed wetland 3. I'll show you a picture of it in a slide or two. But what ended up happening is we built constructed wetland 3, and then the tap stopped working. So it never actually operated as a constructed wetland. And that's just a factor of the environment which we're in. We got fairly lucky with constructed wetland 1 and 2 that the taps still carried on working. But in constructed wetland 3, what ended up happening is too many connections were made to that standpipe, and the pressure just dropped off completely. And when we raised the taps, there wasn't enough pressure in there for the taps to work. So this is when we went in at the end of the project to take a picture. It shows you the 3 different wetlands and where they were in October 2022. Constructed wetland 1 was still functioning, but you can see instead of it being a subsurface horizontal constructed wetland, it is filled up with sludge, and we've got the water that is now on the surface. The plants are alive. October is the end of winter, so they don't look so healthy. As summer goes on, those plants become more green. New ones start sprouting. What ends up happening in constructed wetland 2, it's been flooded. with sewerage. The one thing I've learned about sewerage is that it's pretty good at growing things like tomatoes and dock plants. So what you find is that those plants have now started to grow. And constructed wetland 3, as I said, the tap stopped working, and so it stopped being an active site, and so it ended up filling with rubble. What we did shortly after this is that we closed down the functioning of constructed wetland 2. So it now just works as a cleaning site. So we still have that cleaning area, but it doesn't go into that wetland. It just acts as a wall. At constructed wetland 3, the residents asked us to take out, and in constructed wetland 1, we actually removed all the gravel and cleaned it. I haven't been there in 6 months, although my colleagues have been through there. But we have just got some new funding, partly on the back of winning this award. And so we'll be going back in and to see if we can try to solve some of these problems. So what are the key lessons learned? We need to be careful about being too successful, because while it makes the systems easy to use, they can overload them. We need to acknowledge that low maintenance systems are not zero maintenance systems. And so there's still going to be some maintenance that is required, and we need to work with the community to try to work out how we get to do that in the most efficient way. We learned that it's very difficult to work in this rapidly changing context. You'll notice in the pictures, for example, sometimes there's a house there and sometimes there isn't. And that's purely a place of when those pictures were taken, because the context was changing so rapidly. There are things that we are not in control of. So many different types of service delivery failures of overloaded systems, sewage spills, lack of water delivery, lack of moving away solid waste. So solid waste gets blown into the wetlands themselves and can clog them up. But despite all of these things, we can and we did make a difference in the context where we chose to put in an effort. The project is making that water safer. The wetlands are working as hard as they possibly can. We learned that it's incredibly important to work with the community in designing, redesigning, constructing, involving the community in helping them take ownership as much as possible. And that this is also a way of injecting capital and providing jobs for community members where they have none. There's so many people just wanting to come and help us for what seems to me totally minimal amounts of work. And of course, in my last slide, to acknowledge all the many people, both researchers and students who were involved in this project, both here in South Africa and at our 2 other research sites in Sweden, at Linköping University and at the Helmholtz-Zentrum for Umweltforschung in Leipzig in Germany. So we had students at all of these centers working, not just, I've shown you the practical implementation side, but we also had students working in labs to see how these systems were actually working. And the money came from something which is called the Water JPI, which is EU-funded work. And how EU funding work involves is that essentially the JPI stands for Joint Project Initiative. So what happens is each individual country contributes to a pot, and then that money is then assigned to the project. So we had money from Germany, Sweden, and from the Water Research Commission in South Africa. So without further ado, I'll stop at that point and ask if you have any questions. I haven't been monitoring the. I'm just going to stop sharing for a second so you can actually see me, and I see that there's no questions. So either you've all fallen asleep, or alternatively you've been blown away and just waiting for me to stop talking so that you can be ready to ask your questions.
Thank you. Yes, let's see if anyone has any questions. You can either raise your hand or put it in the chat. It doesn't matter. I'll start with one though, Andrew, because it was absolutely fascinating. One of the most interesting things I've heard in a while. I was interested, does the season play any role in what you measure there? Because I noticed the E. coli was highest in August.
Yeah, so yes, it does. So the E. coli will be highest in August because, well, first of all, it's warming up. So we're getting a lot more bacterial activity happening at around about the same time that the plants are also in the wetlands are actually at their weakest, because they've now suffered through a deterioration in their performance through winter time. So yes, that was part of the reason for having the project over multi-years, was to be able to look at seasonal changes. So we do have seasonal changes. That particular part of data which we're collecting there was, so we had multiple different types of data collection points. So we had data points where we were going in once a month and collecting. That particular data point which I was showing you was where we were going in every single week, and going in every single day of every single week for a period of 6 months. So what you've got is an accumulated set of data across a 6-month period. I report that data because it's probably more reliable than just going in once a month, because all sorts of things can happen when you go in. We try to do it so we could try to average it over as many data points as possible. I see Sarah Jane's got a question. Should I hopefully that answered your question, Annika.
Yes, no, thank you,
yes,
thank you.
Yeah. Was the construction of cement wetlands a viable option? Does scale of the wetland make a difference? Would you increase the size of the wetland with respect to, okay, so there's a lot of questions in there. I'll try to see how many I can answer. So size, obviously, I hate to tell this to all the men in the audience, but size does matter when it comes to a wetland. Particularly as we saw that our wetlands probably weren't large enough for the amount of E. coli that's in there. But we're also restricted by space. So there's only a certain size which we can build them, and until we start running out of space. You see those sort of rivers or gullies that are running through there, people will build on top of them. So they exist for a limited period of time. Unless we can get in and build them, people will build over those. So that space will no longer become available to us. And we can't build a constructed wetland under a house because there's no light for the plants to grow. And also we have the problem of clogging. How are we going to clean it? How will we get the gravel out? In terms of the materials, I neglected to mention this when I was talking, but all the materials are sourced locally. So all of the cement, the gravel, the bricks, even the plants, all of that is all sourced locally from locally available materials. We tried as much as possible to use recycled materials, because that's what people are using anyway. So essentially, when it comes to bricks, for example, we use 2 different types of bricks, either bricks which are created by aggregate and ash. So what they would do is they would take ash and they would take aggregate, mix it with cement, and then create their own bricks. Or alternatively, they would use recycled bricks which would come from an old construction site or deconstruction site, and they would chip off the cement that was on there, and then we would try to use those reused bricks as much as possible. And when we didn't have enough bricks, then we would use the bricks which they had made for themselves. Listen, the cement and the gravel is coming in from outside, but again, we try to source it locally for 2 reasons. First of all, we didn't want to add additional transportation costs, because that contributes to non-sustainability. And we also wanted to try to make sure that we injected as much income into the community as we could. So within those constraints, we try to do as much as possible. There were some things. The one thing we really struggled with was waterproofing, particularly when people built their houses right up against the wetlands. It was difficult to seal them on the one side. So we really struggled with waterproofing, and we tried stuff which we had to buy outside, and there we went to the Alex Mall as much as possible, to the builder's warehouse there to buy materials. So some of it was sourced outside of this community, but we were trying to find solutions to what was going on, which started off by trying for people inside the community to try to help us identify problems first, and then we couldn't, to just try all sorts of other solutions. Graham, thanks. Graham's question is about was local, provincial, national governments, as they've shown an interest in this. So one of the diagrams I didn't show was our stakeholder analysis, which we conducted right at the beginning. And we had identified local government council, and so that Johannesburg City Council and local governments, in the case of provincial government, they were involved both at the beginning. At the beginning, they told us it couldn't be done. At the end, they told us when we gave them feedback at the end of the project, they told us what a wonderful job and how can we help this move forward. and have actually helped us source some additional funding to try to resolve some of the issues which we've come up with. So yes, they were involved. They've shown a tremendous interest when we got it to work, and a tremendous amount of apathy at the very beginning when they told us that it wasn't going to work. So they have been involved, sometimes positively, sometimes negatively. Who really wasn't helpful was the local councillor. And there are some political affiliations that I'll try to avoid mentioning here because this isn't a political presentation, but there are some political ramifications. This area is in a ward where only a very tiny proportion of the ward is in Siswetla, and the rest of the ward is made up of areas like Buccleuch and Kelvin. And so the ward councillor is usually elected by people not in Siswetla, and usually doesn't have a particular interest in the needs of Siswetla. And so the unhelpful comments that we get when the councillor came and visited were things like, well, they shouldn't be here, which isn't particularly helpful because they are here and they're not going anywhere. They were moved here by the city itself. The original inhabitants of Siswetla were moved and planted there, and their original shacks were built for them by the city of Johannesburg, by the very council which he represents. And so they're not going anywhere. So saying things like, well, they shouldn't be here, and these are illegal connections, and all of that sort of stuff wasn't helpful in the project, and created a lot of animosity from the people inside the project, the residents in particular. So we've had positive and negative experiences of that. Renee, okay, so it seems like the failure is with the maintenance of these systems, as CWs tend to be maintenance heavy in the sense of inflow versus outflow. They need to be regularly flushed and permanently inundated. Okay, so there are many different types of solutions here. They are far less, so there would be far less maintenance. We need far less maintenance for a constructed wetland than we would, for example, for a drain, a sewer system, given the situation which we're operating in. So a sewer system regularly gets clogged up with things which get thrown down the toilet, which shouldn't get thrown down the toilet, and things which inadvertently end up in the piped sewer system because of the environment which people are living in. There's nowhere for them to throw away their rubbish. So rubbish accumulates in the community and then gets washed into drains through stormwater or through wind, which blows into the area. So when we compare a sewage system to a constructed wetland system, it's far less maintenance, and the maintenance is much easier because they're open systems. So it's easier to get the gravel out and move the gravel back in. Having said that, we can actually think of a number of different solutions which would be easier than just taking all that gravel out, washing it, and putting it back in again. And those include things like having settling tanks, which generally end up operating. We hadn't thought about them because we have an issue of smell, and then we still need to think about how do we remove the sludge. But we might be able to coordinate it with other types of systems that are in there. So the toilets they use are portable toilets, so septic tank type toilets, and the council is fairly good at coming in once a week and with the honeysuckers and sucking that sewage out. And so if we connect into that system, what we could do is we could actually have the sludge taken out once a month, or perhaps even more frequently than that, once a week, depending on how those systems are operating. We still need to see how we can get those sludge systems working. I gave a talk to Rotary last week, and there was a person working there in as it turns out, he was working in the mining environment, but they have flocculants and other types of material that can help speed up the settling process, and also reduce the smell from the settling process. So we might work with them to try to speed up the settling process and they hopefully get the systems to work better. What we might be able to do is also connect them in series to one another. So we can see how we can get them to work by having a channel on the side, and also connect a bunch of them in series, so we can have them a much longer system and a much longer residence time to cope with the cleaning process. Valerie's question, sorry, you maybe want to answer all the questions, but I'm just going through them, and maybe there are people with their hands up that I'm missing. So stop me, Annika, if I'm getting ahead of myself here. Valerie's questions about water from the tap, was it municipal or water from another source? So the water in those taps largely, not largely, entirely is municipal water. I would frequently wash my hands in it, drink that water. It's entirely drinkable, that water. It's of the same quality that comes if you live in an urban area in Johannesburg or Pretoria, or for that matter, Cape Town. It's the same quality of water that you would find in your tap. If you lived in a smaller urban center like eMalahleni or somewhere like that, we've tested the water in those environments. It's not great. This water is much better than you would get in some of the smaller towns in South Africa. However, if those taps fail, and we have, as probably many you might have read in newspapers or experienced yourself, if you live in Johannesburg, we're starting to experience a certain amount of load shedding and failures in our potable water supply. And so they also have tanks which are provided, which didn't exist when we started this project, but when we finished the project and when I was there in 2020, earlier in 2023, I noticed that there's a number of tanks installed. So that water is provided also again by the municipality. So it should be of a good enough quality, but we haven't measured that water. So I don't know what the quality of the water is those have been installed after the end of our project. I'm not sure. Sarah Jane's question: where does it flow to? It flows to the Yxgay. Yes, that's where it goes to. So yeah, that's pretty much where it ends up. You can see when we've removed quite a lot of the sludge. So the quality of the water when it reaches the river, provided we don't have sewage overflows, is actually better than what it was when we have beforehand. Just purely in terms of color, so it's less of that sort of dark gray color and more of a sort of a light gray color, more of what you would expect something when you talk about gray water to be. I mean, that's another finding from the study. The paper which we're writing at the moment is characterizing what is gray water. So these types of constructed wetland systems have been installed in various places around the world, but mostly in global north contexts. And what they consider to be gray water is of a vastly different characteristics to what we find in an informal settlement. The type of thing which we talk about as gray water in this environment is what they would consider to be black water, sewerage, in other words, in a global north context. But we can show that it still does work. It is operating. Almost running out of time. Waiting for some verbal questions to come through. So any water your wetlands was better than prior to the wetlands. So any water, sorry, I must have been a misspelling there. RAM, sorry. Does your mic work, Sarah Jane? Oh, any water from your wetlands, F missing. Any water from your wetlands was better than prior to the wetland. Yes. Pretty much in most cases, except when we had so what we notice is we would sometimes get pulses, and we think the pulses come. That's one of the things we need to monitor a little bit more carefully. So what we did in our monitoring is we monitored at the same time each day. What we might find is that actually it might vary during the course of the day, because what you would find is you'd have a lot of people coming to wash early in the morning. Because that would give them maximum amount of time for their clothes to dry during the day, and then what would happen in that context is we get a lot of this washing water, which would just push things through. So we'd have this pulse effect, and if we measured in one of those pulse effects, we'd get a large amount of E. coli coming out the other end because it was just pushing it through. So I think what we'd have to do, and that's one of the things that we're planning to do with this additional funding which we've got, is actually to look at measurements. So instead of measuring once during the day, or actually we measure twice during the day, but measure it at multiple times during the day to see what would happen during the course of the day. For example, we would expect in that situation that the treatment effect would happen best in the late afternoon, overnight, rather than and perhaps in the early morning before the washing starts, rather than during the washing cycle during the day. How many constructed wetlands are there in Gauteng, and is there a database or a GIS layer available? Good question, Renee. I have I don't know of any other wetlands other than the ones that, constructed wetlands that I've been involved in. So other than the one which is now still functional, and another one which we built in a commercial property, which I'm probably not allowed to name, in another project which we were involved in, those are the only two that I know of. So a database or a GIS layer would be great if someone could find where these, if there are others that have been constructed. There we go. Enika says that Bolu, sorry, thank you, get my French right. Bolu College had built one on their school grounds, and so there may be others that people have built, and of course there may be some in people's properties that they may have built privately. So we don't have a database of those. It could be a project for someone to try to find out, although it may be quite difficult to work out other than sending out messages to people and giving talks like this and saying, do you know of one? But in these types of environments, the Bolu one are the only three that I know of. In there.
Thank you. Are there any other questions? It seems like
we're winding down. There we go. Thanks for getting in contact with the Agricultural Research Council. Also have one or two. Renee, thanks. That's great. It was actually one of our intentions to build a constructed wetland on one of the school properties too. But there's a couple of problems with that, of course. If no one's responsible for it in the school, and we're talking about schools in fairly underprivileged areas. So I see that's Jackie. I think Jackie Brown is also, could be a practical and easy to become a school project. I think we would need some funding to go along with that so they could worry about the maintenance. But that was one of the things about education that we were looking at, integrating it with education systems so that children could learn about that. We couldn't identify a relevant school. Most of the children in this environment are actually bussed out to other schools in other areas. So the school which is closest to here is actually a school which is looked after by the legacy Indian settlements, which is Marlborough Gardens. And so they are not the same people who are living in the same area. But I don't see any reason why that can't be a project which we could put together. They are quite fascinating processes, and we don't always know how they work. We have some ideas. The lab guys have been working very hard at trying to understand how they work, but there are way too many variables here, including the fact that we weren't allowed to export some of our grey water to Germany, where they were building the lab systems. Germany and Sweden, where they're building the lab systems. They wouldn't let us put the grey water into tubes to send it across. It was just too dirty. So yeah, there are different ways of trying to understand how the wetlands work. The Joburg Zoo has a constructed wetland. The Joburg Zoo has a wetland. It's not quite the same thing as a constructed wetland. So it is a wetland that they have constructed, which is a slightly different concept from a constructed wetland, which is used in an engineering sense. So I have been to the one at Johannesburg Zoo. So it's a wetland that they have constructed on a tributary to Zoo Lake. So there's some good suggestions kind of coming through over here. Agricultural Research Council has a couple. Pam Esterhuizen, sorry, we'll answer that one. What about the botanic gardens in the country? It could be a good target area, especially for learner education. These are all wonderful suggestions. Thank you. Right, schools through SEEP program and through WESA. And some schools have land adjacent that could become a bigger project with veggie gardens. Okay, so that's something which I wouldn't quite advise yet, is to combine a constructed grey water treatment system with a veggie garden yet. We're not actually sure what the impact is of using water with E. coli in it in vegetable situations, other than to say that we probably wouldn't recommend it for green leafy vegetables because it does accumulate on the leaves. we have we took some tomato samples because tomatoes seem to grow really well in sewage. It's a hint if you want to grow really nice tomatoes. So the tomatoes grow really well in the sewage water, and we've taken some of the tomatoes, and there's no evidence of E. coli in the tomatoes themselves. You've just got a pretty big yuck factor of thinking about where your tomatoes grew. So I can see Inika's face there going, oh my God. But yeah, they grow they grow fast, they grow well, they grow huge, big tomatoes in sewage, and there's nothing wrong with the tomatoes. But you've just got to worry about the psychological factors of worrying where your tomatoes came from. Tomatoes for the win. Thanks, Jake. I think I've used my hour, so could use hybrids. Yeah, hybrid constructed wetland systems. The ones I have seen on they're using, the ones I have seen have used bioswales. So in other words, to collect runoff from car parks and areas like that, rather than just letting it run straight into the rivers. Yeah, car parks and those types of areas create another type of dynamic in that they collect a number of different petrochemicals. And so we haven't tested things like petrochemicals. There is some interesting work that's actually being done on bacteria that feed off petrochemicals. So there could be all sorts of hybrid ways of, for example, skimming off the petrochemicals which tend to float. So in other words, instead of having a subsurface constructed wetland, having a surface wetland, skimming off the petrochemicals, linking that to bacteria which feed off the petrochemicals. So there's just so many different types of ideas that you can come up with when you start thinking about it. So, Inika, I'm going to hand over to you because you probably want to close up.
I think people can carry on talking about this for a long time. But thank you so much, Andrew. That was absolutely brilliant. I really found that fascinating, and it just makes the mind go all sorts of other places besides marking, which is wonderful. Thank you so much. And we wish you all the best for the rest of these studies and whatever else you're going to have in future. Maybe we'll catch up again in a year or two and just hear what's been happening.
We've got some fascinating stuff on seasonal forecastings. So for farmers, some work on acid mine drainage remediation using using nature-based solutions. And another project which we're just starting and trying to look at all of these emerging chemicals which we find in wastewater treatment. We find that end up in our wastewater treatment plants, like PFAS, microplastics and stuff like that. And we're going to be looking at different ways of characterizing that and looking at a trust of wastewater treatment plants. So we've got quite a few projects on the go, all looking at water space, and looking at possible solutions for sustainability of perhaps South Africa's most important resource, which is water.
Yes, absolutely fascinating and so relevant to what we teach as well in the classroom. So thank you. All right, thank you to everyone for joining.
Thank you very much. Good luck with your marking, everyone. Hope you make it through. I see lots of pictures for my teacher friends of lots of big frazzled hair at this time of year. So good luck. Enjoy it.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye, everyone. Have a good evening.
Right, keep well. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye, Bridge. Nice to see you. Nice to see and hear you again.